Oops. What is it? Oh, it's for reading. Okay, maybe start, please. Okay, welcome to the last talk in this short series this year. Once again, I give deep thanks to Brett Steele for his support of this series with all the facilities of the AA. Thanks also to everyone who has come to these evenings. And thanks to the Arts Council. This series has been supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. Adam Lowe's talk this evening, De-materialising and Re-materialising, is of particular relevance to the theme of mapping and the digital that lies behind this series. I hope you agree.
I'm going to talk about that.
Adam Lowe founded Factum Arte. Factum Arte makes facsimiles. Why is that so fascinating? First, the tools that he invents, or Factum Arte invents, in order to do this. Concrete printers, laser scanners with special properties, and so on. Second, the use of soft matter, matter which organizes itself into medium-scale physical structures. Third, the fascination of the claim that his making of, for example, Veronese's mid-16th century painting, The Marriage at Cana, and what he says is that it is one of many possible performances of the piece. The facsimile is no longer a copy of the original, but a performance. And it need no longer be composed of similar materials either. It is not identical, yet it looks exactly the same. One might ask, the same as what? If many artists today set out to map the original, whether that be a painting, a stream of information about population, social activities, or whatever, it is nevertheless in order to produce something different. But here the digital mapping of the original, via quite different paths and dissimilar materials, results in the same. It is this process that fascinates us. For Adam, originality as a process is connected with physicality. He spends time working out why a thing looks as it does. And this is, in his words, a deeply materially led study that ends up with an understanding of what the thing is. That, he says, is what is involved in making a meaningful facsimile. Speaking of the Veronese facsimile in the refectory of San Giorgio in Venice, Adam adds, if you end up looking at Factum Arte rather than looking at Veronese, then we have failed. Adam was a painter in the 1990s. He founded Factum Arte in 2001, and in 2009, the Factum Foundation for Digital Technology. Digital Technology in Conservation. Factum Arte's Tutankhamun's burial chamber will soon be open to the public. It is working on the restoration of frescoes of a bird's eye view map of the countryside surrounding Bologna in the Pope's private quarters in the Vatican. It is working on the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, and there are many, many other projects. Factum Arte also works with many artists, with Grace and Perry on tapestries currently on show in Birmingham, and with Shehzad Dawood, who will have a show in April at Parasol in London. In 2009, Adam Lowe was awarded the Microsoft Prize for Les Humanities Scientifique by Sciences Po in Paris. A recent publication with Bruno Latour, The Migration of the Aura, or How to Explore the Original Through Its Facsimiles, is in a book entitled Switching Codes. There is also a Factum Foundation 65-page PDF you can download from the web. It's extremely informative and very beautiful. Please welcome Adam Lowe.
So I'm going to do a ramble. So this is not a structured talk. So the way I tend to often respond to an invitation like the one to talk here is to put together a mountain of slides and images relating to different projects that are of interest, and then I'll meander from there. About 2 weeks ago, I did a similar meandering, so I hope any of you who were at both, and Mark I know was, but I hope not too many of you who were at both will feel that I'm being very repetitive. But actually tonight I want to start in a very different place from where I was going to when I talking about de-materialisation and re-materialisation. Last night was the opening of an exhibition at the John Soane Museum that I hope you'll all get a chance to go and see. I think it's one of those curious things when, in this case, we'd been working with Piranesi's prints, and with the Italian architect and designer Michele De Lucchi, and with the Cini Foundation in Venice, to put together an exhibition of Piranesi's work that rethought Piranesi, that tried to treat him as a living, dynamic designer, not just as someone reinterpreting the past. So it's a very anachronic exercise to rethink radically what Piranesi was doing in the 18th century. And I'm not going to touch on Piranesi tonight, but last night, or yesterday actually, it happened more in the daytime, I started thinking. And so I want to, in a way, start off with a funny thought that I haven't really thought through. So again, and there'll be quite a few thoughts that I haven't really thought through that will come up tonight. But when we made Piranesi objects from the prints were done in the 1760s, and most of the designs that we were working on have never been materialized. In fact, there was a group, so some were meant to be based after the antique, but even those probably weren't, and the remainder were very much Piranesi designs with the sort of Venetian sensibility conditioned by his knowledge of Rome. And I started thinking about, partly because we were asked a lot, but about the, the duality between manufacturing and manual practice. So in a way, Jacquard's loom, which was built in 1804, so after Piranesi had died, was really the example where manufacturing was moving away from manual activity. And the weavers in Flanders and the north of France took off their shoes and attacked the looms. They were saboteurs, their shoes were sabots, and they were fighting to establish a difference between mechanical creation and manual creation. Then later, people were struggling to try and establish a difference between the analog and the digital. The Jacquard loom is the first example of a digitally driven system. It was what actually inspired Babbage to make the first, effectively the first computer. So there's then, after the mechanical and the manual, there's the analog and the digital. But really, now we're in an age where digital technology can handle so much data that perhaps we can think very, very differently about the analog. So perhaps the analog is really just a digital system with enough redundancy to appear coherent. So normally you'd see the dots, but in this case you don't. And then we've been taught to think between the virtual and the physical. So somehow these two things, they're always in opposition. But we're now at a time when the virtual can be physical, and the physical is entirely dependent on groups of digital artisans with very, very different skills. So what we did at the Soane Museum is to show these objects and to show all the material evidence about the making of those objects. And so the exhibition, in a place which is all about material things, material design, Soane using it as a teaching tool to demonstrate both his own control and use of a space and light, but also as a tool to show how decoration works, how form works, how models work, how paintings work, and it still has, I think it's right, the only remaining early 19th century architect's studio, which you can't really see, but it is in there, and I hope it'll be open to the public one day, but it's a bit fragile. So it's somewhere, we're in a world now where the virtual can be digital, can be physical, and where you need groups of people with different skills. So really what Factum Arte is it's a group now, it's grown rather too fast and there are too many, but that's just life. So it's a place where we have engineers and software writers and academics and conservators and artists and moulders and casters and people who operate all sorts of bits of equipment and people who can gild. And so it's really a melting pot of very, very different mindsets. No one person can do everything. And at St. Martin's, we tried 2 weeks ago, we tried this experiment which in my life had been very important, when crossing disciplines, crossing normal professional boundaries seems to be the most important thing that we can focus on at the moment. But ensuring that there's communication across boundaries. So at St. Martin's, I was talking with a historian of science called Simon Schaffer, with Bruno Latour, who's a philosopher anthropologist, and with Jerry Broughton, who's a writer and actually a professor of Renaissance studies at Queen Mary. But Jerry and I work a lot on cartography, on mapping, usually on mapping places that don't exist. So it was a strange mix where between Simon, Bruno, Jerry and I, over many years, we've developed a way of understanding and a way of quite good communication. But I'm often shocked by how unfluid ideas are when they try and cross from one professional practice to another. And so when structuring Factum, I mean, it actually has no structure. That's one of the interesting things about it. But we're interested in the sort of the liminal boundaries between things, how ideas can permutate from one form to another, from one mindset, one skill set to another. And I think this, and this is my preamble of a thought that's half-formed, I think this is probably the most difficult thing that can happen. Interestingly, we've now got more and more architects in Factum, and there seem to be more and more architects who are disillusioned with the old modernist laminar world and are looking for something else. And I find that very exciting. So, just because that's where we started, I put up this image. This is one of my hobby horses, but trying to understand the difference between originality and authenticity. I suppose in a Walter Benjamin sense, they're inseparable, but actually they're moving apart. So it's what Bruno and I refer to as the migration of the aura that I actually don't believe in, but that's another subtext. This is a facsimile of a painting in Palladio's great refectory on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. In the very late 18th century, Napoleon's troops cut the painting from the wall. So the painting, I mean, in Venice, you can't really have frescoes because of the dampness. So material qualities are things I'm going to keep coming back to. But you can't have frescoes because of the dampness. So this is the equivalent of a fresco. It fills the entire wall. It's actually painted on canvas that's stuck to wooden backing panels. And Napoleon's soldiers, to get it off the wall, cut it into 7 horizontal strips, and then quite large numbers of them rip it off. So it probably lost, it's hard to say, about 30% of the paint in the removal. It was carried off to Paris, where it was put on public display in the Louvre, in the new Museum of World Culture, in a way that Napoleon was assembling. And it was the most famous and most important painting in the Louvre throughout the whole of the 19th century, until it got knocked off its perch by this little painting that actually hangs in front of it. So I rather like this photo because this was a photo that was taken while we were recording the Veronese. So you can see some of the team in the background reflected in the glass in front of the Mona Lisa while we were actually working. And curiously, we had to work at night, but they always leave the lights on the Mona Lisa, which seems to me to be a very strange thing to do. But the Mona Lisa is always illuminated, and it's the only painting that is always illuminated, and that's probably for some security reason, and it's behind glass. We were asked by Pasquale Gagliardi to make an exact copy, because during one of the dialogues on San Giorgio, Pasquale had tried an experiment of projecting the painting onto the wall of the refectory. But really the relationship between the building and the painting is a very material one, dependent on the light in the space, dependent on being able to see both the building and the painting at the same time. And this immaterial projection didn't allow either of those things. And as a result of a conversation actually with Bruno Latour, who expressed the dissatisfaction at this immaterial thing where you could either see a reproduction of a painting or a room, but you couldn't see the two together. Pasquale asked us to do the facsimile, and over a period of 2 years, and I'm not going to talk about making the facsimile tonight because there's other things I want to run through, but we installed the facsimile, and then a couple of years after the facsimile was installed, Peter Greenaway asked if he could do a projection onto the painting. So this is a whole new engagement and new life that this painting took on as Greenaway turned it into a performance using multiple projectors and sound. And what I like is that when we unveiled the facsimile, I was incredibly nervous that people in Venice, that serious art historians, that the great intellectual community who were preserving the heritage of Venice were going to feel in some way disappointed. But the response we got was completely the reverse. And I think Peter Greenaway using it as a screen for one of his performances is a very good example of how an object, or how an object has a biography, and how that biography can take many, many forms that allow us to see the painting or the object in very many ways. So, when I within the next 2 weeks, so now, we've actually succeeded, because I found a textbook written by a man called James Hall, who in the 18th century was determined to disprove fundamentalist views of creation and demonstrate how great turbulent upheavals could happen in the production or the creation of the earth as we know it, of geology. And he was determined to prove in the workshop that he could make lava. And using some of the insights about adding mica, about keeping a kiln up to temperature, so once we've poured it, we can then enter the hull of the mould into a kiln and cool it very slowly, or cool it under pressure. So we're now starting to put vast weights on top of the lava. But playing with physical material is the thing I most enjoy. So although we're a digital workshop in many people's eyes, 90% of the work we do is material. And one of the great experimental physicists, Patrick Blackett, who ran Imperial College, described the work of an experimental physicist as cultivating an intimacy with the behavior of the physical world. And I've always thought that was one of the most beautiful descriptions for the practice of architects, the practice of artists, the practice of just about every creative process. It's dependent on an intimacy with the behavior of the physical world. And so this approach, whether it's routing coal, which we were also doing last week, again, the hot things, trying to make a 24-hour hourglass. So how you actually shape the neck of the hourglass, how you close it right down, then drill a hole, then find the most perfect microspheres of measured size that will flow through the neck of that hole. This is very much about an intimacy with the physical world. If there are too many of them and the hole too narrow and not polished enough, they block. They can stick themselves. And obviously, the neck, the flow has to be continuous if we're going to have measured time. At the same time, we're working with 3D printing. Now, some of this early talk, and I'm sure some of you are, especially here at the AA, are much more familiar with 3D printing technologies than most other people I talk to. But this is quite an exciting example of what's going on in Belgium at the moment in a company called Materialize to make a structure called tetrashell, which is a 3D printing plastic with a complex internal structure so it can be used as a mold, so it can be used as like a wax that can be encased and burnt out. In Madrid at the moment, we're playing with tetrashell forms. In fact, this is an ordinary 3D printed form that's being burnt out at quite high temperatures and then cast in aluminium. In this case, and I'll run through this a bit quickly at the beginning, the interest is in noise, is in excess data. So the artist, who's an English artist called Matt Chivers, wants the defects kept. He wants us to play with the defects on the surface of a form, which is an exceedingly complicated form. And again, the kind of conversations we have are about the structural qualities of the inside of 3D printing. So these actually, both of these photographs came from when I, by mistake, broke one of the Piranesi, it was the chimney piece that's in the Saône, and I broke the stereolithographic print. And inside was fascinated by the image on the left, where the 3D printing is creating a three-dimensional hexagon, which is the supporting structure for the printed material. And the small triangles and squares are actually noise, which are a byproduct of the complexity of the surface, whereas the form on the right is just the structure used within the tank around an object. But there's something about being inspired by the complexity of how you keep things discrete, how you make things, how you make a 3D print stand up and not collapse. So, I mean, and this is all in the last 2 weeks, the bit we're playing with now. So this I like very much because it's the first time we've been able to cast a flexible aluminium. Normally, when you cast aluminium, it's quite brittle. But this is an alloy that allows us to bend it and move it and shape it and reshape it. One of the projects we've been working on in the last 2 weeks is for an artist to make trees, so casts of trees. But the problem we were having is they oxidize and we couldn't get them clean enough. So this is a typical worktop from actually 5 days ago, where we've gone through a whole lot of different things to try and work out how to keep the leaves of a tree clean over time. And the yellow zinc coating bottom left is probably the answer. The gold-plated coating, so this is actually, a lot of this is just wet stuff. So we're in gold plating tanks, we're silver plating, we're bleaching and burning in acid, we're nickel plating. We're trying lots of different aluminium mixes. The stainless steel, which was the one I thought was going to be easiest, didn't work because we couldn't get the temperature up without destroying the tree. But, for example, the goal is to build a tree that really has all the qualities of a tree. This is a specific tree that's now in the Connaught Hotel but the new works are for Mark Quinn and are based on bonsai trees which are mutated. For Conrad Shawcross, we're working with a fabricator in England who has now shipped all his equipment over to Madrid, and we're doing precision milling of bronze forms to make visualizations of sound for Conrad. And again, I mean, at the same time, we're milling alabaster to try and build alabaster versions of concrete forms that we made for Anish Kapoor. So there's a whole lot of things that are happening simultaneously as one material transforms into another, and trying to understand what happens. So the bit of my life I like best is when we were on this project, thinking Anish's pieces are big. Alabaster blocks I can get in the north of Spain, the maximum is about 80 centimetres around, so very seldom you can get a block that's bigger than 80 by 80 by 80 centimetres. Usually they're smaller. But in Egypt, you can get blocks that weigh 30 tons. So I was in a quarry in absolutely the middle of nowhere near Tel Amana, which is north of Asyut in central Egypt, in a quarry that's been mining alabaster continuously since Akhenaten's time, when he moved the capital from Luxor to Amana. And I find this sort of, again, a word I like, but this jump across time, this very outside of time research, something that's thoroughly enjoyable. Again, for an American artist, trying to do precision routing of alabaster without breaking it. This piece is about 3 meters long, and what we've been doing here is actually from a 3D scan of the holes in a spiral notebook ripped out. It's the negative of that. But trying to play with forms so that if you look at the brown bits on some of them, those are veins in the alabaster that we can't necessarily see while we're making it. And this piece, it's a rather magical object. Probably that will end up being row after row after row of them. It'll go through another level of transformation. In the workshop with our 3D printer, which is effectively it's an ABS one, so it's using like a hot glue gun. We're trying to decalibrate the 3D printer. So it's not printing a regular form, but it's printing a shifted form. And again, in St. Martin's, what I love about my working relationship with someone like Simon Schaffer is every time I try and explain what we're trying to do in the studio, he tells me that it's already been done by many other people. So this is when Darcy Wentworth-Thompson's proof or disproof of Darwin's obsession with how bees' hives were formed. So Darwin thought bees were master builders that would somehow push from both sides of the wax to form it, and Darwin had beehives that he watched and was putting red dyes to see where the wax went and to see how the bees were really master builders. And Wentworth-Thompson was busy saying, no, this is actually how form makes itself. And 2 weeks ago, Simon, like he always does, then goes much further. So he brought in a character I'd never heard of, called Osborne Reynolds, who, and again, it's a sort of, this is a Simon slide, so he was an expert on ships, sand, and sewers. And people who cross disciplines, who aren't just stuck. So I think being an amateur is much better than being a professional. So if anyone wants to insult me, they say, oh, what you're doing is a professional activity, and I hope not. I think you need curiosity. I think you need to constantly question how something happens. And I think the fact that the turbulent flow in eddies and whirlpools is more ordered than the flow in a pipe is a very, very nice thought. Simon, of course, throws in something else that I don't understand at all, And this is really slightly annoying me because I can't quite get my head around this statement by Osborne Reynolds, which again is to do with soft matter and hard matter. But I think these kind of statements just make me think. And I don't have an answer because I don't understand what's being said, but we'll set up a series of experiments in the workshop to see if these things are true. And I haven't quite worked out how we're going to do it. But turbulence, I think, is desperately important. And this is a beautiful visualization by Etienne Marey. So I'm going to go quite fast in a second, but there's something about a person at the end of the 19th century trying to work out how to visualize turbulence. And I think these photographs are some of the most beautiful photographs taken from that period. But Marey wasn't just doing it with smoke, he was doing it with pearls. So tiny pearls in water can show you the eddies and flows of a turbulent form. Slightly later, but so the very beginning of the 20th century, you have characters sitting on the top of Ben Nevis, and this is Wilson, who his job was to observe the clouds. He was a meteorologist, and he sat on the top of Ben Nevis observing clouds and thinking, I don't want to be up here, I want to do this in the studio. So he built what's now called the Wilson Cloud Chamber, and the Wilson Cloud Chamber led to an understanding of nuclear physics. This is all about cultivating intimacy. With Simon, and I'll do this very fast, but this was the bit that I haven't looked at this particular video, which was a piece that I played with back in 2000, trying to follow a cosmic ray through a block of gelatin. So it's trying to follow something that's microscopic, looking at it through a microscope. So there's an actual thickness of this block. With Wilson and others, they stacked blocks of gelatin. But this is cartography. This is the mapping on the bottom of a sheet of gelatin so you know where you are, so you don't get lost. And this is noise on the top that shouldn't be there. So in this particular, I mean, this is a very long video that this is a tiny clip from, but it was trying to follow one cosmic ray as it passed through a block and and reacted or was interfered with by other rays. Very, very quickly, and then I'll finish the history. There's something magical about the interest in the 19th century with synesthetics, with sensations that cross between one form and another. So Margaret Watts Hughes's visualizations of sound, I think, are some of the most extraordinary experiments done in Barnsbury by someone almost no one's ever heard of, and probably no one would ever have heard of had she not been picked up by Walter and Annie Besant, who were into theosophy, who thought they could visualize ghosts. So she was then producing experiments to try and visualize the presence of a ghost. Or these unbelievably beautiful experiments from the 1930s, where you take a layer of mercury and you float talc on top, and smell interferes with the talc on top of the mercury on a molecular level and creates visualizations of smell. So one of the beautiful things about digital information is it can be anything. It can take any form. So once it's digital, it can go in many, many, many different directions. And I think there's a lot of artists, a lot of architects, a lot of people working with digital technology at the moment who are very, very excited by this possibility. New technologies are very seldom new. This is one of my favorites, and this character is very little known. Bruno Latour actually introduced me to him. It's in a museum in Chalon-sur-Saône, and it's the first example of photographic 3D recording from 1920s. if you look how old he was when he died, I'm still trying to confirm Givaudan's dates because I think he's 23 years old when he dies. And to build the first 3D recording system and a 3D output system based on effectively the cartographic principles of contour lines to produce low-relief portrait sculptures in the 1920s is really incredibly exciting. And it's this kind of curiosity and playfulness that has actually led to a transformation of the world we're currently living in. So, the big news, as everyone says, is 3D printing, and 3D printing is really no different from what Givaudan was doing, except we now have computational power to control the information much more accurately. So this is a laminar build in a 3D printer, very simple. There's probably one in the AA that follows this one. This is one of my favourite videos, but this feels to me like the work that Etienne Murray was doing. But this is a large, it's the mammoth stereolithographic printer in Louvre in Belgium, and we work extensively with them. And actually, I just like going to Belgium to watch this happen, because there's still, even though I've done it so many times, there's something magical about watching laser lights play over the surface of an object, and then a few hours later to simply pull an object out of the cloud of water. It's almost a mythical thing, and there's something magical, and the wonder doesn't go away. So the little thing that it said at the beginning of the screen, at the beginning of the talk, which is you have to know where you are. To be a 3D printer, you have to know where you are. Once you know where you are, you can materialize any information in 3 dimensions. So this is the robot in Factum. This robot is actually quite old, but it was built to weld Audi cars. And now it's doing precision milling, and it's about to be modified to print concrete. Printing cement, printing concrete is one of the things that we did with Anish Kapoor for 3 or 4 years. Again, the people you collaborate with are fundamentally important in shaping ideas, and working with someone like Anish that's an artistic sense. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but we went a completely different line from most of the universities who are trying to print concrete or cement, mixing it in the nozzle. And I went back to a material study of Roman concrete, and then onto the physical properties of concrete. So we started varying the aggregates and building a thixotropic concrete so we could pump it rather than be dependent on a grainy mix which is being mixed in the nozzle. And with Anish we printed things that were up to 3.5 meters high, which the new cement printer is going to print 5 by 5 by 5 meters and be movable, and it's modular. So to me, the love is being able to control the material you're printing. So whether it's pleaty and foldy and chaotic, or whether it's regular and colonic, or whether it's sort of shitty, all of these, or whether it's smooth and being troweled as we go along, this kind of experimentation with form and with material, soft material, conditions an awful lot. When you're printing concrete, the biggest problem is keeping everything discrete, stopping it collapsing, stopping mess. But that's also true right down in the digital data itself. And I've always rather liked this image, which was an image sent to me by Brian Cantwell-Smith, who's he was a computational scientist and now a philosopher. And Brian is one of the people who's had a very profound influence on how I think about information. And this is the ideal explanation from, of a digital state of being off, on, off, on. And that is the impulses of an electrical signal measured. So there is no discrete beginning and end, and all of that work has to be done in the algorithms and in the programming to keep the data discrete, to stop it rotting and breaking down. One more little tangent. When my son was little one day, he bought some sugar puffs, and this fell out of a packet of sugar puffs. And it's Thierry Henry looking quite young, and it's just a piece of plastic. And the thicker the plastic, the less light comes through it. So you have a photographic image in a block of plastic. And this has been the key to the work we're doing, which I'm going to run through very fast, with the scanner. But once tone can be formed, then you're into a whole new territory, and you can start rethinking how you can both archive data, but also what you can do with it. And playing in a block of alabaster, we can make photographic images just like Thierry Henry was in plastic, but cut into hard matter. And so this is a portrait, and the image on the right is it seen from an angle. But thinking about it, so jumping slightly, but not as much as it seems, thinking about knowing where you are. This is a panoramic camera. The door in the background, that the Pope's bedroom is behind the door. In fact, I can't say that anymore. Ratzinger's bedroom was behind the door. The new Pope now sleeps elsewhere. But this is a panoramic recording system. So again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this because with stitching software like PT GUI and many others, you can form very high resolution, large format images relatively easily. This one happens to be a bit more sophisticated than some, and it's got a 600 millimeter lens on a Cana EOS 7D mounted onto a pan and tilt head made by a German company called Klaus. In this case, we actually had two. So we've got a slave which is doing the flash, following the camera, and we recorded the whole of this room in 3 days. I won't do it now, but I can, to me, this room is one of the extraordinary works of art in the world. And one of the first great conceptual works of art. So if anyone's interested, we can come back to that at the end, and I'll explain why. But with the pan and tilt camera, the panoramic camera, we're not only recording across a surface, but you can change your focus and record, I don't know if any of you saw that happening, I'll try and do it again, and record through multiple layers of focus. So now if we've got high resolution across a plane, and high resolution on every layer of focus going through the planes, you can merge those together with an algorithm that discards any information that's out of focus to get an image on one hand that's completely in focus. So this is the work of a Spanish artist called Manuel Franquelo, who actually was originally my partner in Factum, but is now spending all of his time on his own work. He does also work building the scanner, so I'll come back to him in a minute. But this image is one I love when you see it, and I mean, actually it's best in an art fair because everyone goes up to it and they look at it, and you think it's a photograph. And in fact, it's printed on gesso and it's printed in pigment. And so then everything says, no, it's not a photograph, there's something wrong, so it has to be a painting. And then the whole relationship between you, the viewer, and the object has become completely unsettled. But from, for example, the same data set, because we've now got depth, we can produce a 3D image. And this was a test we did for Google, who wanted to do a show at the Grand Palais based on models of buildings on a scale of 1 to 600, and they wanted to do a kind of Google Earth version, but they couldn't get the data. And we managed to extract, well, these were from a little thing in the studio, and in fact we never followed it through because it went off on a tangent. And the tangent was that I had dinner with a plastic surgeon in Milan, who has now moved from being a plastic surgeon into working with anti-aging, so injectables. The whole new thing is not Botox anymore, it's hyaluronic acids that can be injected to volumize and lift and reshape. And Massimo said, but Adam, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a scanner that could do instant capture of someone with their eyes open? Because the problem of all the photographic and 3D recording systems was the patients, well, the victims had to have their eyes shut. And that basically meant that your whole perception of the face couldn't be natural. So with Manuel Franquelo's son, who's 23 years old, we spent a week discussing things, well, a few hours. And Manuel then built a 3D scanner that does instant capture. So this is one of Factum's team, Bianca. It's made of millions of polygons. So the polygon count is staggering. It's entirely photographic, and we can take the data and mill it in 3 dimensions. So now we're working on the software for understanding how, well, with the doctors, understanding actually what people want to see, what happens when you inject 100 milliliters of hyaluronic acid here or here, and what happens to the rest of the face. So it has to be a dynamic model. But in a sort of perverse way, and I'll come to it in a second, I think there's a pure conceptual work of art about using anti-aging technologies to fund the preservation and conservation of works of art of the past. So there's a funny way that what we're trying to do is to completely think outside the box. And if every 100 milliliters of hyaluronic acid we could make 10 pence, I could do a major impact on preserving things like the Valley of the Kings and other sites. We'll come to that in a minute. So one line is photographic 3D scanning. Think back to the tone. The other line is laser 3D scanning. So this is a laser. In fact, you can see the laser stripe on this little bit of perspex. And every single bit of this scanner, except the linear guides, actually, but every single bit has been milled and made in the workshops in Factum. All the software has been written. And the reason we did this, because thinking back to what I just said about trying to preserve things in the Valley of the Kings, I have to be able to make 3D scanners that record amazing levels of data very cheaply. That means we have to make them ourselves, and we have to do all the software and the programming. So this is data from 2 scanners. In fact, not the one I was just showing you, because the one I was just showing you is even higher, but I didn't have it the day I did this. But at the bottom, it's from a Minolta 3D scanner, and the top one is from a Spanish one called a Nub 3D, which we use all the time. In theory, the Minolta has higher resolution than the Nub 3D. But as you can see, this is the bottom one is not out of focus. It's one piece of resin milled. But what you can see on the bottom is we're able to capture general shape, which is enough for most uses, especially if you're using it for architecture. But what we're interested in is capturing surface detail. So you need general shape and surface detail. And in terms of what I said about cultivating an intimacy with the physical world, we want the data we're recording to correspond directly to the data we're looking at. And in this case, it's a bit of brick in the university in Venice, where we were doing a master's course on digital architecture. This is how most things in Factum happen, usually over a bottle of whiskey, in a bar, on a napkin, saying, could we build a scanner that does it? Then in the workshops, you take things that hopefully don't cost too much money. In this case, we've got a €30 webcam, some glass rods, a stepper controller, a laser pointer from a Chinese shop, and a stepper motor from an old disk drive. And with that, Manolo, if you go onto Factum's website, I've dropped a link. So if you go onto Factum's website, you can see It's quite a long, but it's, I think, a very poetic film about all the things that are involved in thinking through how to capture 3D data, from these strange electrical conflicts that get set up, this is static electricity interfering with the data, that the solution in this case was to put ferrule coils around the wires. But my favourite one was the redesigning of the laser itself. So this is the laser stripped right down, because we had a lot of problems with speckle noise. And speckle noise, so I mean, again, this is not an art video, this is a video to see if we can film speckled noise. On the long video, well, the early video I was going to show you, Manilow explains what speckle noise is, but it's basically the noise that happens between your eye and the object in the air that's breaking down the laser. So as I look at all of you now, and probably if you're looking this way, you can see a sort of thickness in the air. There are little speckles that move, and those are what condition speckle noise. The scanner moves by going backwards and forwards. In this case, it's sort of a 2.5D scanner, if you like. So what we're trying to record is the surface of a painting, or the surface of a tomb, or subtle variations to the surface. So it's local cartography, not large scale. It's very focused. But I think it's amazing with 2 cameras and a laser that you can record that level of detail about a surface. So why is this important? It's important because, for example, the tomb of Tutankhamun lasted 3,300 years in perfect condition. It was discovered, in 1923, and in the 91 years since, it's now at great risk and in very poor condition. So we occasionally, not always, so in the introduction, we make facsimiles a lot. We do make facsimiles, but not always. So not every application will result in the production of a facsimile. But in this case, this is the facsimile of the burial chamber of Tutankhamun in our workshop in Madrid. It's based, and I'll explain how we get there. So that's a red painted concrete floor with a bit of sand on, and you can see that it doesn't have a ceiling at the moment. The sarcophagus has been recorded at resolutions of 100 microns, the wall's a little bit less. So the most important part of this is it means we have the data. So we've recorded the tomb. We can take the data back and we can study it. The red patches, well, sort of magenta-y, those are areas of paint loss almost certainly since the tomb opened. There's one part of it which we're still trying to see if that's true or if it's a repainting from antiquity. The blue areas are accidental damage that's never been filled. The magenta ones have all been repainted. So about, let's say, 15% of the north wall of Tutankhamun's tomb was painted in the 20th century. This is quite important because we may have lost many, many details that will give fundamental clues to why this tomb is important. For example, and I'm not going to do it now, one of our collaborators, Nicholas Reeves, has, I think, definitively proved that the most famous artifact on the world, on the planet, the death mask of Tutankhamun, was almost certainly Nefertiti's death mask, recycled. So what I love is the way objects tell stories, and what saddens me is when those stories are altered or skewed by interventions that lead them or lead the forensic evidence to be obscured. This is an early photo. I'll skip past that. The second important part is that all of the little red dots here are injection marks. So how you preserve something that was built to last but never to be visited in an age of mass tourism is an exceedingly difficult task. And Tutankhamun's tomb is exceedingly important because we have fantastic documentary evidence from when it was made, from when it was discovered, all the way through to the present day. And that can't be said of many objects. This is the kind of condition the walls are in now. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about what's going on, but changes in temperature, changes in humidity, dust, wear and tear cause these objects to deteriorate very fast. So logistically, to actually do a recording like this, somehow you have to get all the equipment down to Egypt. Most of the people we're working with there don't really understand what we're trying to do, just like most of the people we're working with here really don't understand what we're trying to do. So getting all the equipment down into Egypt, getting it into the tombs, getting the political will and the permissions sorted, doing the recording with white light scanners and laser scanners, and high-resolution photography, and very accurate color notations, because what we have to do is digitize it, and move all the data to Madrid, reassemble it all in Madrid digitally, and then re-materialize it. So if we don't have the exact color details, and you don't get them from Kodak color cards, so if you don't have exact color and sheen details, it's impossible to do that. But one of the things I like, I mean, my interest in noise, is that when we're stitching the color data to the three-dimensional data, by far the best way to do it is to use, for example, the microbacteria or the paint loss that has clearly defined edges to allow us to perfectly register the high-resolution color to the three-dimensional data. Then, using milling machines, the three-dimensional data is routed and returned to the physical world. After it's routed, it's assembled into panels, and those panels are gradually put together to form seamless connections one from another. And then the really clever bit is how you get the color onto the surface of complicated three-dimensional form. In this case, we tried a lot of systems before we came up with the final solution, but this is a flatbed printer that was built in Factum Arte, so it's actually a canonized Epson, which is fitted onto linear guides, and we can reposition it and reprint in perfect registration as many times as we want. So the sort of exercise you can do in Photoshop, you can actually do on the surface that you're printing. And at the end of the printer, at the top of the slide, you see a sort of crumpled pile of unattractive looking stuff. What we're actually printing is a very, very fine, slightly elastic skin that is fitted exactly onto the surface of the physically routed form with a contact adhesive, positioned and repositioned. These two are the wrong way around. So it's done like this. Then vacuum pressure is applied. And then at the top of this slide, you have the skin unstuck down. And at the bottom of the slide, you have the skin stuck down. So it picks up all of the surface detail because of its elastic nature and because of its thinness. I mean, it's incredibly thin. It tears very easily, but it works beautifully to do what we're trying to do. The ceiling, so all of the details of the object have to basically be convincing, and until you get to the end result. So on the left is a photograph of the facsimile, again still in Madrid, and on the right is the photograph taken by Harry Burton, who was a great Hollywood photographer, in the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1923. The only difference between the two is we're not using the same lens. I mean, we should have done. But what we can also do is work with the historians and the experts. And in this case, on the right-hand side, you see the south wall, and the area at the left-hand end of it is what's known as the missing fragment. So this was removed by Carter, put into a box. It's now been lost. Probably it'll turn up in the Egyptian Museum when the Egyptian Museum moves to its new site. But I think the reason no one's been able to find it is they're all looking for a fragment. And actually, it's just under 2 meters high and about 1.50 meters wide. So it's a rather large fragment. But we were able to reconstruct in colour the missing fragment from the black and white detail using the colour data that we'd recorded in the tomb. So right now, well, on the 15th, I head back to Egypt. But right now, we've dug the footprint of the tomb next to Howard Carter's house at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings. And as of last week, the site now looks like this. So the roof has gone on the Treasury, top left. The walls are being built up. By today, the walls should be at their full height. And on the 15th, we start installing the facsimile. And then by the end of April, the museum, well, the Carter's house is in the background. The road going to the Valley of the Kings is on the right-hand side of the picture, and the Valley of the Kings is sort of somewhere about 1 kilometre away. But we should have the exact facsimile of the tomb. And the idea, which is quite a bold one, so facsimiles have been used in, for example, in Altamira or in Lascaux or in some other sites. But in those sites, you don't have access to the original. What we want is the tourists to go back to Egypt. At the moment, there are very few. To visit the original tomb in the Valley of the Kings, then to visit the facsimile, and then to start talking. Because the goal is that we can get people to say the experience of visiting the facsimile was qualitatively better than the experience of visiting the original. There are a number of reasons why that could be the case. There are a number of things we can do in the facsimile that can't be done in the original. But I want there to be a chattering campaign so that the visitors become part of a cutting-edge process to preserve the tombs rather than a destructive force leading to their rapid deterioration. Very, very quickly. And then, how are we doing for time? Sorry. How much longer do people... Mark, what do you think? Another 20 minutes, yeah? Or whatever. So... No, I'm fine. So, I will, but here, I'll do a couple of things very fast now. The tomb in the Valley of the Kings is one example. The work we're doing in Bologna to record the facade of San Petronio is much more about recording sculptural form, but really the story is the same. So the story is that the sculptures on the outside of the church are decaying, both with time and because of the pollutants of the 19th and 20th century, and because of conservation practice to try and consolidate them. But using white light scanning systems, the entire sculptural, the 3 main gates of the facade have been scanned at high resolution. So the data's been recorded, processed, and again, a part that I like a lot is trying to make digital data be honest, but not have unaesthetic qualities. So the image on the right is the kind of visualization that happens within the software of the scanner. The image in the middle was a halfway stage, and the image on the right is a rendering to try to make the surface look not like marble. So we're not trying to falsify it, because otherwise we'd have to map detailed color information onto the surface, but to make it not unpalatable to look at. And the deep collaboration with the conservators working on the church has been a very, very important part of the work. So here, I mean, it's slightly hard to see in the slide, but we're scanning the turban of this figure that's been removed. In fact, the general view is that the turban's on back to front, and that in a restoration 30 years ago it was put on back to front, and so we're now doing a lot of virtual things to try the turban at different jaunty angles. But before the restoration, this figure by Amico Aspettini had two arms and was rather dirty. During the restoration, it became very, very clear that the arms were about to break and fall off, so the left-hand arm was removed. We scanned it in this state, and as you can see, the scan on the right shows Joseph of Arimathea without his turban, because we scanned that separately so we could get a good detail. But you can see the left arm is removed and the right arm is still there. We then made a 3D print of the removed arm in a lightweight material, and this was actually a rather nice test to fit the arm onto the stump. So this is a bit like medical again. This is a 3D printed prosthetic that goes on, and we were working with the conservators to try and find a perfect solution for gluing the possible new arm back on. But if you look here, now the right-hand arm's gone. So this one also was just crumbling. So under the surface, the marble had turned to dust, and the right arm now looks like this because it's got no structural integrity left. And the conversation that's going on in a way with the superintendent and the Opificio di Pietrodura in Bologna is to say, would it be better to replace this incredibly important sculpture that's 12 meters up with an exact facsimile and put this piece inside where it can be protected and preserved? Or is it better to leave the original on the front until it's collapsed completely and then replace it with a new one? So normal practice in Milan, for example, is to replace new ones. In Florence, sometimes they remove them and replace them. In Bologna, they are discussing it at the moment, but normally they don't remove them. So the question here is it better to preserve or is it better to let it go? And this is a discussion that's will be collectively made. I'll go past this. Oh, the beautiful thing is in the 19th century, they did a plaster cast of the entire three doors. And this is the central door in the V&A. So there's a whole subtext about plaster casting, which again, probably I should do as another complete talk, because I think plaster casting was one of those times when people, at the end of the Victoria, so the 1860s, when people were aware of the damage that was happening to buildings that were neglected, and were trying to bring the information into a central repository, in this case the plaster cast court at the V&A, but there were plaster cast collections all over Europe and America that were absolutely fundamentally important for a detailed and meaningful study of the objects, and fundamentally important for conservation. So, for example, in the British Museum, there were many, many objects that arrived painted in good condition, were then cast. Some of them lose their paint, some of them didn't, and the tomb of Seti I in Egypt is in disastrous condition because it was cast. But then subsequent conservation treatments can lead to the object in the museum being very, very different from the condition it arrived in. And the plaster casts, in many cases, often reveal much more about the surface of the original object than the original object in the museum. So there's a long debate going on. Now, I'll end very quickly with a slightly mad project, which we did talk about in St. Martin's. I talk about it any chance we get. On the left, so think the London Eye for 1 second, which I like, but as a testament to the beginning of the 21st century, it doesn't seem very ambitious compared to the 19-meter in diameter globe that used to sit, so on the left of the screen, that used to sit in Leicester Square with hydraulic platforms to lift the visitors up and down so they could study the surface of the topography of the Earth in relief on the inside of the dome. The dome was made of cast iron, housed inside a very beautiful building. and it sat in the middle of Leicester Square from 1851 until 1861, because it had initially a 10-year lease, and it was so successful they then failed to renegotiate the lease because I don't know who owned it, probably the City of London, or maybe not, wanted too much money, and so James Wilde decided to put it down. But to me, this was one of the great visionary ideas that allowed us to think about cartography and the world we inhabit in a very different way. On the right was the French version, much bigger, much more ambitious, but never built. That was a statement of fact, but never built. And it was going to be half the height of the Eiffel Tower, and it stood near the Eiffel Tower, and around the revolving floor were going to be displays about the progress of mankind as it went up towards the top, where then you had the viewing tower overlooking the whole of Paris. And Etienne Marey, who did those beautiful turbulence pictures, was commissioned to make a section about technology and the growth of technology. This is perhaps my favourite ambitious project to allow us to think about the world. It's Biosphere 2. Biosphere 1, of course, is the planet we inhabit. Biosphere 2 was built in the 90s in Arizona, based on some parts on designs by and with Buckminster Fuller, but it was conceived much earlier. But it was an initiative to build a closed system. The spin-off of Biosphere 2, slightly sadly or cynically, but honestly, is Big Brother, the television, the reality TV, because 12 people lived inside here in a closed system for 18 months while they were monitoring all of the different ecospheres that were built within the biosphere. And this is a project done by a group called Ecotechnics that was a private group who raised $300 million to realize this project. And I think it's that kind of motivated, focused development of an idea. To me, this is a work of art. Not just, I mean, I'm not totally sold on the architecture, but on the concept. It's a complete work of art to try and build a closed system. Of course, the idea was about could we build this on Mars, or the Moon? So linking back to 3D printing, you now have many people championing the idea of 3D printing a closed environment on the Moon, which can then be inhabited and populated. What we're trying to do in Madrid is to build a model of the lithosphere. So the lithosphere is the hard surface of the Earth with all the water, all the fluid stuff removed. There's lots and lots of questions that I'm not going to do now. Do we consider the ice as part of the pedosphere or part of the lithosphere or part of the hydrosphere? So there's a whole lot of ways that you can think. But I love this image from 1690. This is the first image I've ever been able to find of the surface of the Earth with the water removed. What we're playing around with in Madrid, and the work I do a lot with Jerry Broughton, is to try to find different ways of thinking and visualizing the projections that allow us to put the globe onto a flat surface. So this is a normal projection, the sort of Mercator projection we're all familiar with, mixing bathymetrics, so data from sea depths, with topographics, so data above sea level, to produce a relief model of the world. This is actually 50 centimeters by a meter, but we've exaggerated the surface 100 times. This is the projection we're currently playing with, so I've put raking light on so you can see it a bit better, because it's more equal in terms of area, but also it's very important that in this one, Antarctica and the Arctic are stretched to infinity, top and bottom. So somehow, when Mercator was doing it, they weren't important. So they weren't the great commercial driving forces that they are now. And they weren't the great ecological driving forces that they might well be now. And so this is the projection we currently prefer. The reason I exaggerated the height 100 times is because if you don't do that, on the scale we want to build it, which is 25 by 50 meters, you would only have 8 centimeters of height, and that wouldn't be very impressive. What we need is a strange, unfamiliar, spiky world that allows us to renegotiate something we think we're very familiar with, but simply don't know because it's too big to see. Just to orientate yourself, Factum's based in Madrid. This is a view looking towards Antarctica from above Madrid. So you're going down the Mediterranean. You can have Madagascar sort of upper on the right-hand side. Antarctica is marked, the Himalayan plateau. So the idea is to build it in Venice, on a football pitch, and this is the football pitch, in fact. And it won't look like this. This was a very early visualization, but you build it and then you flood it. So you can start to rethink the relationship between the fluid matter and the hard matter. And this is where I'll stop. Well, I'll do one or two after. But so this is showing you from a Mercator projection to how we get to the projection we prefer, which is exactly the same cartographic system, but just a different point of view. Antarctica's become important. Japan suffers a bit at the top. This is special effects. And there is the football pitch on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore behind the bird. And of course we can zoom in. The animation, I couldn't find the new one, but we've spent a lot of time, because whenever I do this, you get very different reactions. And so we're trying to answer each reaction. So this is just a flyover. I'd love people to be able to walk on it, whatever it is going to be. But I think health and safety will probably prevent it, because I think someone falling off Argentina and spiking themselves on Las Malvinas might not go down too well. But here you're going down the Red Sea, Antarctica in the distance, the Himalayan plateau we just shot past. Australia, incredibly flat. So for me, there's something, well, actually, Antarctica would be much flatter if it wasn't all ice. So there's a very important question about why don't we remove the ice from Antarctica? And recently there were the beautiful sonic maps of Antarctica with the ice removed. So perhaps that's the kind of Peter Greenaway, that's why I showed the Peter Greenaway film earlier, the kind of Peter Greenaway multi-projections that can create a different sort of mindset around how we approach this object. But as I said, now we're a bird, we're bird's eye view, and we're starting to flood it with water from the lagoon. This is a regular speed of flooding. So very quickly the water goes somewhere, and then if you look for Florida and the difference between, there it goes, New Guinea and Australia, that's about where we are now. There's a sort of pause. Bangladesh went quick, and we go on flooding until we reach the top of Everest, about now, and then we drain it. And this becomes a repeated activity over a 6 or 8 day period. But I think very, very exciting things can happen as you can watch geological time, as you can watch, you could project political boundaries onto it. You can have a vast number of ways of engaging with this object. So as it's going to be built in Venice, the current idea is it should be built, I could build it in polystyrene, but that kind of sends the wrong message. I could build it in concrete, but that also is one of the major global warming causes of global warming, so probably we shouldn't do that. So as it's in Venice, we thought we should build it like Venice is built, with millions of piles driven into the lagoon to hold the buildings. And that is the Mediterranean. This is the area around Venice. So this is 1 square metre of our map. And the current proposal is that we should build it in alabaster, because I thought we should do it in a waste product, and because I like alabaster at the moment. So these are 1.5 centimetre alabaster pixels, being laid out onto a prepared surface, so that you never get a visible side onto any object, onto any of the pixels. And this 1 square metre has taken 3 or 4 of us about 2 or 3 months to make. And we have another 499 to go. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I was just wondering about funding. I know that's not a particularly creative question.
It's a very good question. We don't have any. So this project, it probably needs about 3 million euros funding. But
Sorry, how much?
about 3 million. It depends on how much free labour we use, how many volunteers do the pixel application. But I thought it would be easy. I mean, we've got the site, we've got the place. The idea is quite straightforward. It's something that captures most people's imagination. And yet, when we first presented it, we weren't flooding the whole world up to the top of Everest. So we were flooding it up to different projected levels. But immediately, the scientific community, the climate change deniers, all of the different political issues, lobby groups came in and said, no, you can't do that, that's not right, this isn't right. So then we decided to turn it into a poetic act, where you just keep flooding and draining, and people can choose whatever layer they want to project things onto, however they want to read into it. And we haven't actually got any money at the moment, but we'll keep going. I mean, it'll come. I mean,
I suppose I was also asking about the whole of Factum Arte in terms of funding. Do you do it project by project?
I worry about that a lot. I don't know how it works, but it works. So everyone's paid well. Each project has to be viable. I think the answer to that is Factum Arte has to be viable, but it doesn't have to be profitable. So there are ways of thinking about how to organize a structure. So, for example, the Tutankhamun work has not had any funding from the World Monument Fund or from UNESCO or from any of the political organizations that you would probably expect it to be funded by. But that's probably because there are a lot of secondary issues that condition how professional bodies act. And in this case, the hope is that once people see it, then it snowballs, and then there are reasons why people will want to fund it. I mean, people tend to want to fund things that are famous, and Tutankhamun has celebrity on its side. So I think if we can win the argument that it's possible to do it, and win the argument that it's worthwhile doing, then we should be able to raise the money to give the scanning equipment to Egypt. So at the moment, there'll be 2 people there from April, and we start sending scanners down and training local Egyptian operators to record the tomb of Seti I. That'll probably start in September. And then there'll be 2 scanners, and then there'll be 4 scanners, and then there'll be 6, because the task is enormous, and the scanners can record about 2 square meters a day if they're going well. The tomb of Seti I is about 3,000 square meters. So logistically, if we're having to pay Western, European level salaries, then it would become prohibitively expensive. But if you're actually empowering a local community and giving them the technology and the training, gradually then we'll give them the equipment to do the fabrication of the facsimiles as well. And the plan is to build facsimiles of, well, I have permission to build facsimiles of Tutankhamun, Seti I and Nefertari. So Tutankhamun's still open. Seti I and Nefertari are both closed. So one of the normal knee-jerk reactions is people saying, but you're taking things away. You're stopping people seeing these things. And actually the argument is we're trying to allow people to see things that are closed, or in Sala Bologna in the Vatican, things that no one sees because you can't have people wandering around the Pope's bedroom. So that's a very important, famous site that's closed for a very different reason. Funding is always tricky.
Could you tell us more about the room next to the Pope's bedroom? Then?
About the Sala
conceptual part.
Bologna?
Yeah.
Very, very fast. The Sala Bologna was built it was built on the orders of Gregory XIII, so he's the one who gives us the Gregorian calendar, and he was Bolognese. So when he became Pope, his first act was to build the Sala Bologna. I think as an example of cartography, it's fabulous. So on the end wall is the largest city map, bird's eye view of the city of Bologna, so the largest map of the Renaissance. On the long wall to the right of that map, as you were looking at it on the slide, is the whole of the province of Bologna. On the other wall, between two windows, is a view of the city of Bologna from San Michele in Bosco, which is just outside Bologna. And on the other wall, facing the long wall, were three windows looking out, well, there were more, but large windows looking out over Rome. So as the Pope, as Gregory stood on his family crest on the floor, surrounded on three sides by the city he loved and knew, he looked out over his the city he's now responsible for, the strange political Machiavellian world of politics in Rome. Above his head is a celestial ceiling. It's an extraordinarily beautiful celestial ceiling. But it has one slightly unusual thing, that most celestial ceilings are the stars as you look up. But in the Sala Bologna, it's an outer terrestrial view. So it's the stars looking down from above the stars onto them. So as a beautiful conceptual statement, as he stands surrounded by everything he loves, looking out over his worldly domain, he looks up and he sees the world, he sees the stars from God's point of view. And I think that's one of the most profoundly beautiful examples of conceptual art from the 16th century.
You said something about with the digital and how much data can handle that we can rethink the analog. Could you?
Yes, what I said was something that came up, I suppose, quite a long time ago, but it's really a thought of Brian Cantwell Smith, so one of the people I mentioned earlier. But Brian was always trying to define what's digital about digitality and what's analog about the analog. And it was in a conversation once when Brian said to me, but Adam, really, the analog is just a system with enough redundancy to appear continuous. Okay? So really the analog is a digital system, but it just has enough capacity, enough redundancy, so you don't see the elements from which it's composed. So in a way, it's trying to play with this idea that I started with between, if you like, the mechanical and the manual, between the analog and the digital, between the virtual and the physical. These are all categories that don't really mean the same things now that they probably did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And again, I mean, it's worth looking, for example, at an exhibition that was at, help me, Mark, at the Whitechapel, I think, called Cybernetic Serendipity from 60-something, which was a rather wonderful exhibition. I only know the catalogue, by Yesha Reichardt, looking at digital technology as it was emerging at that time. And of course, it was really about a dream of digitality much more than about the reality, because it was still fairly embryonic.
You spoke about noise as something which interests you in some of the slides, and I was wondering whether any of your work in the physical manifestation of the digital products, you let the noise dictate, apart from, I think, the Anish Kapoor's, the collaboration. Obviously, that was material more than the digital translating it into physical world. So I was wondering whether there are any other examples.
Yes, I mean, I don't know, there may be a copy here, but in my first collaboration with Simon Schaffer was in 2000, where we organized an exhibition called Noise that was at the Whipple Museum of the History of Science, the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, and the Wellcome Institute here in London. And it was an exhibition where we set out to do an exhibition looking at, how would you say, redundancy in data, looking at universal language, looking at synesthetics, of data synesthetics, and looking at noise in general. But the aim was never to use the word art or science. So we weren't trying to aestheticize science or give meaning to art. We were trying to actually see if there was common ground. So in that case, explicitly, every element of the show was a celebration in one way or another of different types of noise. In the work we're doing, I think the world is exceedingly messy, generally, and keeping things discrete and keeping them tidy and keeping them in their place is quite difficult. So noise when you're making, excess when you're making, is always something you're working with or against. So in that image I showed you from the Matt Chivers, where we're trying to get maximum noise into a 3D print, of course, maximum noise, it just collapses. It doesn't exist. It collapses. And there was a nice, perhaps this is perhaps a better answer, there was a nice thing that happened when we were working with Anish. Again, Simon Schaffer and I putting together a book about the sculptures and looking at soft matter. But Anish was very excited by entropic breakdowns. I mean, I know here at the AA, entropy is quite a hot subject at the moment, and how things break down and how entropy functions. And in a quote from Bridgman, who's one of the people who formulated the whole idea of entropy, there's a rather beautiful description when he's asked if the crystal is an entropic breakdown from the solution in a liquid from which the crystal was made. And he answers that he would be very reluctant to say the crystal was less perfect than the liquid from which it was formed. But in a way, there is an entropic breakdown in the formation of the crystal, even though crystals are what most theorists hold up as pure form. If that answers. enough?
Exhausted you enough. We're way over our time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.